Danny DeVito burned a contract worth nearly $1 million in today's money at a beach bonfire rather than let Hollywood reshape his face. And the woman who watched him do it never once told him he was wrong. That is the kind of detail that gets lost in the noise of a long career. The talk show appearances, the award nominations, the blockbusters, and the cult classics, they crowd out the quieter story underneath. But underneath all of it, from a cramped New York apartment in 1970 to a house less than a mile from his estranged wife's in Los Angeles right now, there has been one constant. One person who saw him before any of it existed and has never looked away. At 81, Danny DeVito has finally said what people who have watched his life closely have understood for decades. She was the only love of his life. And the way that love has moved and changed and refused to end even after it changed form entirely is one of the most unusual, honest, and quietly devastating stories that Hollywood has ever produced, and almost never told properly. To understand what Rhea Perlman meant to Danny DeVito, you have to start at the beginning of him, not of them. He was born on November 17, 1944 in Neptune, New Jersey, into a home that was not exactly waiting for him. His mother, Julia, was 40 years old when he arrived, had already raised several children, and made no real effort to conceal that another one had not been part of her plan. She would say it plainly years later, "I didn't want him, but I'm so proud of him." That is an extraordinary sentence to absorb, for words of rejection followed immediately by 6 words of pride, handed to a child who then spent his entire life figuring out which ones to carry. Danny, characteristically, carried both. His father ran a candy shop in Asbury Park and was, by most accounts, pleasant enough during the day, but evenings had a different quality. Police records show the family home was visited by officers at least 17 times between 1950 and 1955. Danny learned early what children from those kinds of homes always learn: how to read the temperature of a room, how to make yourself smaller or louder, depending on what survival required, and how to find exits. Sometimes he hid in closets. Sometimes he ran to the neighbors. He was also navigating something invisible that most people around him never fully understood. He was born with a rare genetic condition called Fairbanks disease, which affected the development of his joints, his hips, his knees, and his spine, and which is the reason he grew to 4 feet 10 inches. The height became the thing people talked about. The pain was what he lived with. By his 20s, on any given day, his physical discomfort sat somewhere between a 6 and an 8 on a scale of 10. Hollywood, when he eventually got there, told him plainly, "Do not mention it." Weakness did not sell, so he kept quiet, and he kept going. He ended up in New York, sharing a $75 a month apartment with a young actor named Michael Douglas, who had quietly neglected to mention that his father was Kirk Douglas. They split their last $27 on headshots and walked them across the city by hand. Douglas started booking work. Danny kept getting rejected. He parked cars. He once stood motionless in a clothing store window, pretending to be a mannequin. For a stretch, he lived out of a Volkswagen Beetle and showered at the YMCA. He kept that particular detail private for decades, because humiliation, when you're in the middle of it, rarely feels like a story worth telling. Then came the night that changed everything, and it didn't happen on a film set or in an audition room. It happened in a tiny off-Broadway theater on January 17, 1970. Rhea Perlman was 22 years old. She had grown up in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, the daughter of a Polish immigrant who worked in the toy business. She had studied drama at Hunter College, graduated in 1968, and had been waitressing at the Rainbow Room in Rockefeller Center while auditioning for whatever roles she could find. She was sharp, funny, the kind of person who fills a room without raising her voice. She went to the theater that January night for a single simple reason. A friend of hers was in the cast of a small production called The Shrinking Bride. That was it. That was the entire plan. She sat down. The show began, and then she saw him. He was stocky and not conventionally handsome, not the kind of face that was going to get him cast as the leading man in anything mainstream. But he was commanding that room in a way that had nothing to do with physical presence in the traditional sense. Something in the timing of his movement, the weight he gave every line, the confidence of a man who was entirely himself, even in a small venue with a modest audience. It stopped her completely. When the show ended, she asked around, "Did he have a girlfriend?" No. She did not wait for a formal introduction. "I had to meet him immediately," she said years later, still laughing about it. "I came onto him big time." They went to dinner and talked for hours. Danny DeVito would say afterward that he knew within 22 minutes of meeting her that she was the woman he wanted to spend his life with. Not a possibility. The woman. 2 weeks later, Rhea moved into his Manhattan apartment. 2 weeks. Not a month. Not a careful and tentative courtship. Two people from working-class backgrounds with enormous ambitions and a specific kind of toughness that comes only from never having had anything handed to them. They looked at each other and recognized something they hadn't known they were looking for. They would live together for 11 years before getting married. Not because either of them was uncertain about the other, but because neither of them felt they needed a legal document to define what they already understood completely. In January of 1982, quietly and without ceremony, they married. The professional milestones came in that same period. In 1975, Michael Douglas, now a producer, was developing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and fought against studio resistance to cast Danny as Martini, a role Danny had actually played years earlier in a stage production of the same story. He was on screen for 5 minutes and 52 seconds. People are still describing the impression he made 50 years later. The film won 5 Academy Awards. Danny was not nominated, but he had finally arrived somewhere. In 1978, against every piece of advice his own agent offered him, he turned down 3 movie roles to audition for a television sitcom. The character was Louis De Palma on Taxi, mean, petty, and unapologetically awful in every direction. Danny walked into the audition and delivered a 7-minute monologue that silenced the room. ABC was nervous about his height. Creator James L. Brooks threatened to walk if they did not cast him. They cast him. Danny signed the contract without negotiating, even though it paid 40% less than what the other actors were receiving. He did not care. He had read the script and he knew, the same way he had known with Rhea, immediately, and without requiring anyone's confirmation. In the second season, Rhea joined the cast as Zena Sherman, Louis De Palma's girlfriend. The producers had no idea the two of them had been living together for years. They assumed the chemistry was exceptional acting. It was exceptional acting. It was also two people who understood each other in a way very few human beings ever manage. Together, they quietly started Jersey Films in 1983. Over the following 2 decades, it became one of the most consequential independent production companies in American cinema. When Quentin Tarantino had been turned away by other studios, Danny and his partners kept Pulp Fiction alive, gave Tarantino's company money and office space, and let him make the film on $8 million. He promised it would look like a $25 million production. He kept that promise. Jersey Films also produced Erin Brockovich, Out of Sight, and Garden State, among others. All of this while they were raising 3 children and maintaining a rule that no more than 2 weeks would pass without the two of them working on something creative together. Their collaboration on Matilda in 1996 is where that partnership became most visible. Danny directed, played the appalling Mr. Wormwood, cast Rhea as his equally appalling wife, and allowed their own children to appear in small roles. What audiences never saw was what happened away from the cameras. The young actress playing Matilda, Mara Wilson, was processing the news of her mother's cancer diagnosis during production. Danny and Rhea quietly became a shelter for her, caring for her the way you care for someone who belongs to you. Before filming wrapped, Danny arranged for a near-final cut to be screened at the hospital so that Mara's mother could see it before she died. Mara Wilson would say years later that they had felt like her favorite aunt and uncle, that they had made something unbearable slightly less unbearable in a way she never forgot. The man who played monsters on screen was, in the private hours of his life, consistently one of the good ones. In October 2012, after 30 years of marriage and more than 40 years together, they announced their separation. The world responded as though something genuinely important had been removed from it, because in a landscape full of Hollywood relationships that lasted about as long as a promotional cycle, Danny and Rhea had been proof for ordinary people that something different was possible. Rhea, speaking years later on Julia Louis-Dreyfus' podcast Wiser Than Me, was honest without being theatrical about it. It had been very difficult. Both of them were deeply ambitious people, consumed by their work. Some things, she made clear, belonged to them and not to the public. But they did not divorce. By March of 2013, just 5 months after the announcement, a source close to both of them confirmed to People magazine that the love between them had never gone anywhere. They reconciled. They went to therapy, 38 sessions by some accounts. Danny rented out the same restaurant where they had shared an early date. They tried again. They separated a second time in 2017, and still, they did not divorce. Danny bought a house less than a mile from hers. They talked every single day. They met regularly at the same restaurant, at the same table. Their son once mentioned that they shared a Netflix account and texted each other commentary while watching the same shows from separate houses. When asked in 2019 on Watch What Happens Live whether she and Danny would ever formally divorce, Rhea looked at the host as though the question genuinely confused her. "What for?" she said. And in 2022, she offered something more layered. "Sometimes I wish we were still together, because those were the glory days. But these are other kinds of glory days." There is an entire philosophy of love compressed into that sentence, if you let yourself sit with it. In 2025, Danny began speaking publicly about Fairbanks disease in a way he never had before, not for himself, but for children who could not afford treatment, for people living in daily pain with no platform. He had been donating quietly for years,